If you would take your Bibles, go to Esther chapter 6. Esther chapter 6. I spent 12 years in Florida, and while I was there, Ohio State lost to Michigan once. I've come to Ohio, and in 2 years, they've lost both games. I'm considering going back to Florida. I had this great introduction ready for today's sermon based on Ohio State winning yesterday and how the game yesterday was, one of the most important ones in the history of the rivalry, because it really was it all comes down to this moment with so much on the line. But I don't really even want to talk about it too much. Yet it was still true. There was a lot riding on that game as far as, the playoffs and that type of thing. The rivalry with, the fates of two states hanging in the balance. And that's probably overdoing it a little bit. But it was one of those moments where there was so much riding on it. And we saw that last week in the book of Esther as well. You remember we came to the end of Esther chapter 5. We left off, and it was this day before the tomorrow. It all comes down to this. It was that moment in the story of Esther. Chapter 5 had built up to this climactic precipice, and we didn't finish the story last week. I guess I left you hanging. Sorry, that was a really bad pun. But if you remember last week, Esther on the next day, right? The next day, Esther will host her second banquet with Haman and with the king, and presumably will finally ask for the king to save the Jews. But if you remember also, before the banquet, unbeknownst to Esther, Haman is going to go to the king and ask to hang Mordecai that morning. It all came down to this. Really the fate of a nation, the fate of the Jewish nation, that one day will determine what happens. Now it seems, as we leave off in Esther chapter 5, it seems that it's a little too late for Mordecai, because Haman is going to go and ask to hang him before he goes to the banquet in which Esther is going to try to save Mordecai and her people. Maybe at the end of chapter 5, God just might have to cut his losses and try to salvage what he can. If only Esther had asked at the first banquet, right? What was she doing? What was she waiting for? It certainly looks at the end of chapter 5 that in the morning, Mordecai is a goner. But we cling to Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22, the verses we read earlier, 22, 23, where it says that God's compassion and his mercies and his faithfulness are new when? Every morning. Every morning, the compassion and mercy and faithfulness of God is new for us in our lives. And I think it's incredible that in this story, God doesn't even wait till morning. His mercies are also good in the middle of the night. God intervenes here at the beginning of Esther chapter 6 at just the right moment. Know this about God. God may be invisible, but he can always intervene. He may be invisible, but he can always intervene anytime, anywhere, with anyone. God can step down into that story and change the outcomes. And it's true in my life. It's probably true in yours. It's definitely true in the story of Esther. He seems to do it in the most unique ways, doesn't he? And he seems to do it at the most unusual times. And chapter 6 of Esther is no different. Look at verse 1. Esther chapter 6, verse 1. That night, the king could not sleep. That's an incredible statement. Of all nights, that night, The king couldn't sleep. It was that night between all that had happened in Esther chapter 5 and that fateful tomorrow that was coming. It was that night that the king couldn't sleep. The city of Susa is sound asleep, but the king, King Ahasuerus, he can't. You say, well, what's so significant about that? You know, that could describe most of us on some nights. The inability to sleep. God is at work, even in the king's insomnia. God is never not working. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform, William Cooper tells us. So what does he do? He can't sleep. Second part of verse 1. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. He commands for a servant to read the court records to him. One of two things is going on here. He either says, I can't sleep, so I might as well get something done, or he says, if there's any way to fall asleep, it's to listen to the court records. And to hear this guy just drone on and on. It was kind of the Persian version of counting sheep for the king. And yet God is involved in it. Verse 2. Verse 2. And it was found written. It was found written. That's one of those nonchalant phrases in the book of Esther. We've seen several of them. Like, by the way, or, it just happened. It just so happened this way, or in the meantime, or something like that. It was found written, yet it is the providence of God. Of all the court records, of Persia that the servant could have selected, why this one? Why now? Why on that night? Providence is the hand of God in the glove of human events. And guess what? The glove fits very well. It fits perfectly. And as Ahasuerus is listening here in verse 2 to the droning on of the scrolls, all of a sudden an event from 5 years earlier, 5 years have passed, an event from 5 years earlier makes him sit upright in bed. Verse 2, it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the servant reads the part of the scroll that tells about how Mordecai has foiled the plot to assassinate the king. Jump back in Esther to 2, verse 21. That's where we saw this happen. 2:21. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Remember that tiny, insignificant little phrase? And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. A seemingly insignificant phrase. One that we would just read right past and not even remember. Know this, God may be invisible, but to him nothing is insignificant. God may be invisible, but to him nothing is insignificant. He takes mundane, boring details, records them, and then brings them back at just the right moment. That night, when the king couldn't sleep, that night between that one day and that fateful tomorrow, that's when this is read again. Nothing is insignificant to God. And that's true in our lives as well. Nothing in your life is insignificant because God is the artist. Every color, every canvas of your life is his design and his choosing. You ever watch somebody, a good artist, paint a painting, and you see the blank canvas and they start to make some what look like scribbles, just indistinct marks, and you say, this isn't going anywhere. There's nothing. But as you stay with it, what happens? The picture begins to form. And you see this beautiful portrait that the artist is painting. It's the same with God. What look like insignificant little strokes and a little bit of color here and something thrown over here. To God, he says, these are the pieces and the parts of your life that are molding and shaping you into my image, that are accomplishing the will of God in your life. 5 years have passed, and God brings this back up. And here we see that what King Ahasuerus hoped would put him to sleep, God used to wake him up. What Ahasuerus, he just wanted to fall asleep, and God said, not tonight. You're sitting straight up in bed because I got something for you to do. Now notice here, the reading of the scroll, a couple things happen. They read this scroll, and it reminds Ahasuerus of Queen Esther's loyalty to him. Because remember, Mordecai found out about the plot, told Esther, Esther told the king. Why would that be important on this night? Where is the king headed the next day? To Esther's banquet. And God reminds him in the middle of the night, she's been loyal to me. The reading of this scroll on that night also presents Mordecai and the whole Jewish nation positively. Why would that be important? Because tomorrow, in the morning, their lives would hang in the balance. And so God brings this here on that very night. Why did the servant pick that scroll? God's hand directed his hand to that very scroll. And he reads from that scroll. In verse 3, it says, the king asks, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Now, it was custom for Persian kings. They were notorious for lavishly granting or rewarding those who were loyal to him. But when he asked this questions, he realized Mordecai got nothing. He wasn't rewarded in any way. 5 years have passed since Mordecai saved the king. 5 years of being forgotten, of being trampled down, of being belittled, of being on the verge of death. No reward. But God never forgets, does he? The honor may not have come when Mordecai thinks it should have, but it certainly came at just the right moment, didn't it? James 4:10, the Bible tells us, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Rest assured, God will lift up the humble. It just might not be at your time. It's always in his time. It may not be when we think it should come. Had Mordecai 5 years earlier been rewarded, maybe the king looks at this and says, no big deal. But he wasn't rewarded, and God chooses to reward Mordecai at this moment for his purposes. Look at verse 4. By this time, it's morning of that fateful tomorrow. And the king realizes that someone is in the court to see him. Verse 4, the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. I think it's appropriate when we hear the name Haman, maybe you could all say, boo, right? This guy's a bad guy. He's evil incarnate. And he was up that morning, wasting no time. And the king, he's still trying to get out of bed probably. And he realizes Haman's in the court. Haman is there. He's eager. He's ready. He can't wait to get Mordecai on those gallows. Haman can't wait to get one of his best days ever off to a flying start. And he comes to the king, apparently with all the talents that Haman had, timing was not one of his greatest skills. And here in verse 4 and 5 and following, the two most powerful men in the world meet. but they are completely clueless of the other's thoughts and intentions. Neither one knows what the other is thinking, though they are both thinking about Mordecai. Isn't that great how God works? Here's Haman, who wants to hang Mordecai, come to talk to the king who wants to honor Mordecai, and neither one knows what the other one's thinking. The king asks him a cryptic question, verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" What should be done to the man the king delights to honor? Notice the king doesn't say who, but he just says the man who the king delights to honor. End of verse 6. Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Well, that tells you a lot about Haman, doesn't it? Haman's response betrays the conceit of his own heart. He thought the king has to be referring to me, because who else in the entire world would the king delight to honor more than me? Yeah, Haman is an evil man, but he is chock full of spiritual truth and application. There's a lot we can learn from Haman. And here, the humongous pride of Haman distorts everything around him until it makes him the center of the universe. If the king wants to honor someone, it must be me. If there's a good idea, it must be mine. If people are talking, they must be talking about me. If there's news, I must be in it. If there's something to know, I must know it. If there's something to say, I must say it. The 4th century church father Augustine and the 16th century reformer Martin Luther both referred to this type of thinking with the Latin phrase incurvatus in se. Incurvatus in se. It means a life lived inwardly. That the human heart is naturally and diabolically curved in upon itself. And with that malady in place, everything that you do, everything that Haman does is processed through the filter of me. Where is my glory in this? How can I advance myself? How can I be recognized? What are people saying about me? What are people thinking about me? Someone wise once said, we would worry a lot less about what people think of us if we realized how seldom they do. We would worry a lot less about what people think of us if we realized how seldom they do. But the problem with what Augustine and Martin Luther talk about here is this incurving of the heart, where everything that we see is curving in towards us. We're naturally inclined that way. Haman had that curving in bushel baskets. He had it to the nth degree. And I think he's a lot like us sometimes, if we're honest. If we're honest, we also struggle with that. Our natural inclination is to live for ourselves, is to curve in on ourselves. But that's not how the New Testament portrays a Christian to live, is it? That's naturally what our heart desires. That's naturally where our sin nature wants to take us. But the New Testament comes along and tells us, you're supposed to live a life upwardly for God and outwardly for one another, and not just inwardly for yourself. It comes along, the New Testament comes along and completely tosses things upside down for us. Romans 14:7-8. For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. Philippians 2:4, let each one of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Galatians 6:9-10, let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. I think that's what the church in America desperately needs. Instead of curving in toward what the church can do for me, we look out for the glory of God and for the good of others. The lens through which Haman saw the world was what? The prideful lens of himself. But the New Testament calls us to something different. Through which lens will you view the world? Through which lens will you view your life? The lens of me or the lens of Christ? To see the world and to see yourself and to see others as Christ does. Look at verses 7 through 9. Verses 7 through 9 of Esther 6. Haman is thinking here that he's creating his own honor. And see, so he goes big. All the stuff that I would want, right? King says, what should I do to the man who I delight to honor? Haman says, well, it's got to be me. So here's all the stuff I would want. Verse 7. Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. A royal robe, the king's horse, the royal crest, led by the most noble prince. Notice the attachment to royalty. Haman wants to be treated like the king he never was. He wanted public honor. He wanted public display. Oh, you wish you had read Proverbs 16:18, right? Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. For Haman, the pride was there, and the fall was coming. And it comes pretty quick. Verse 10. One of the greatest turns of events in the book of Esther. Ahasuerus says, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai. Here's Ahasuerus doing what he normally does. That's a great idea, Haman. Do all those things. Do them all. And do them all for ... Mordecai. Can you imagine Haman at this moment? I mean, he's thinking it's him. His eyebrows are up. His face is light, right? Everything's great. And then he hears the word, do it for Mordecai. Boom. The text doesn't tell us this, but he actually immediately contracted the old Persian disease called drop jaw. His jaw hit the floor. He couldn't. Now, this is classic Esther, too. Whoever wrote Esther for us doesn't tell us any of the emotions of Haman. It's just on to the next thing. But you've got to see that Haman here, oh boy, this changed everything. Haman comes in to hang Mordecai. He leaves parading Mordecai through the streets as the man the king delights to honor. My, how quickly things can change. Haman left home that morning to hang Mordecai. He leaves the king honoring the one he is supposed to be hanging. How quickly things can change. Never underestimate God's ability to turn things around. Never underestimate God's ability to turn things around. No matter what it is in life, God can turn it around. He is the mountain mover. He is the chain breaker. He can save the husband. He can restore the wayward child. He can heal the disease. He can reconnect a marriage. Mordecai was in sackcloth and ashes 2 days ago. Now he's in the king's royal robes. God can turn any situation around. Now, that is not a promise that he will. That's an acknowledgement that he can. So therefore, we trust him for what is best. It would be wrong for me to say to each one of you that, whatever situation you are in right now, God will turn that around. I can't make that guarantee. But I can tell you that God can turn your situation around. And we trust him for the can. And we trust him for the will. And we trust him for him to lead us in the direction that he wants us to go in life. So verse 11, Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Can you imagine Haman here? Do you think he did it with much enthusiasm? Everybody, I want you to hear this. It was probably more of a, "This is the man that the king delights to honor. Hope nobody hears me." I wonder if Mordecai too, this is creative imagination here. I wonder if Mordecai sitting on that horse wasn't having some fun with it too. "Hey, Haman, say that again. Who's bowing now, Haman?" Think about it. Haman's scheme to hang Mordecai was done. It was over. You can't go back to the king now and ask to hang the one that the king just honored. It's over. And he knows it. This day is not going according to plan for Haman. Just wait. Just wait, buddy. It's going to get even worse. Verse 12, afterward Mordecai went back to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. Mordecai goes back to work after he gets paraded through the city streets. Haman, meanwhile, hurries back with his head covered, sulking to his house. And it says here, verse 13, Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. So he gathers his wife and his friends. He's embarrassed. His head is covered. He was supposed to be the one on the horse. He's like a 4-year-old who didn't get his way. And he goes back to his house, and Zeresh and his friends meet him there. And in verse 13, Zeresh pipes up again, this treasure of a woman, right? We saw her at the end of chapter 5. But it's interesting, this time her words are ominous. Her tone has completely changed. I'm not sure what happened to her overnight, but her tone is completely different now. Look at what she and the other friends say. End of verse 13. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. There's a couple interesting phrases there. She says, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall. I think they saw that incident of Haman parading Mordecai around as the beginning of Haman falling. I think they were starting to see some writing as on the wall, as it were. They say, Haman, you've begun to fall before this guy. And then they say this, if Mordecai is of Jewish descent, which he was, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. What did Zeresh and his friends believe about God's promises to the Jews? That's a valid question. What news or what information what knowledge did they have? I wonder if some of his friends were even Agagites themselves. And they knew, hey, our history is not kind to people that mess with the Jews. That's a surmising. I can't prove that. But somehow Zeresh and his friends know that, Haman, you're going down the wrong path here. Somehow they know the history of the Jews and that they always prevail over their enemies. And they now believe that Haman is the next enemy to go down. This is a very interesting turn of events. Chapter 5, it was hang him like a dog. And chapter 6, it's Haman, you're probably going to lose. Do even pagans realize the power and promises of God? Do even pagans like these guys realize we've got no shot? Verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So the king's eunuchs come to take Haman to Esther's banquet. Mordecai was supposed to be dead by now, but instead he's been honored. Nothing's going right for Haman so far, but at least he still has the banquet with the queen, right? At least she still likes him. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." This second banquet on this fateful tomorrow, King Ahasuerus asks Esther for the third time, "Esther, what do you want?" This is her third golden opportunity. Will she do it? Well, how many more chances can she expect to get? You say, why did she wait so long? Why did she wait 3 times? I think it's the wisdom of Esther here. She baited the hook, and she baited it well. She baited the king into promising to answer her request 3 different times publicly in front of other people. So that when Esther does make the quest, basically the king has backed himself into the corner. He almost has to grant her request. Verse 3, she finally does it. "What do you want, Esther? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." Now, I think Esther says this in a calm way, not a blasting of the king. She doesn't just blurt it out, but even in her request, we see her wisdom. Verse 3 is really her request. She asked for her life and for the life of her people to be preserved. That is what she risked her life for. Verse 3. Verse 4, she borrows from the wording of the decree. You see that there. It says, "I and my people are to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." Those are the same words that were used in the written decree. But notice that she doesn't implicate the king. This is wise. She doesn't say, "You, king, allowed this to happen. I can't believe you would do this." She doesn't. She says, "We have been sold." She knows that the king has the power to deal with Haman. And the last thing Queen Esther needs is the king to go on the defensive. She needs the king on her side, not Haman's. So she's wise in this. Verse 5, somehow the king doesn't quite put it together. I think sometimes he's a little slow. Verse 5, so King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? And where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" He's a little confused here. He doesn't seem to have attached the decree to Esther and to her people, and that she is Jewish. Doesn't seem like all the pieces have come together yet. And so verse 6, Esther gets right to the point. Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Can you see that playing out in your mind's eye? The 3 of them are sitting there. The king's still a little bit befuddled. And Esther says, the one who's trying to kill me and my people is the guy sitting right there, Haman. Having risked her life, having fasted and prayed and hosted 2 banquets, she finally reveals who the enemy is. How's the king respond? Verse 7, then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. Well, the king is furious. He gets up, he takes a heated stroll through the garden. He's processing, right? She's my queen, but Haman's my right-hand man. What do I do here? Meanwhile, Haman had to be in shock. Imagine what he's just finding out for the first time. Verse 6, end of verse 6 tells us Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Verse 7 says Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. Haman knows I don't have much chance with the king because I just unbeknowingly attacked his queen. He hopes Esther will have more mercy. You can imagine him pleading before her, I didn't know. Give me another chance. I'll make it right somehow. You know, earlier that day, Haman was in control of his future, or so he thought. And now he's wondering if he even has a future. Verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. So here, you know, the king is gone. He had kind of sprawled himself across this couch. And apparently that was not a good look when the king came back. The king comes back. The king says, end of verse 8, will he also assault the queen while I am in this house? It appeared to the king that he was in some way trying to assault his queen, and that sealed the deal for him. It says, as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. They cover his face and they take him into custody. 6 hours ago, probably, Haman thought the king would honor him above everyone, and now he has a bag over his head. It is a fearful thing to be an enemy of God. Haman, by lineage and by choice, was on the wrong side of God. Do not get on the wrong side of God. The wrath of God will fall on all those who practice unrighteousness, who set themselves against God, who reject salvation in Jesus Christ. John 3, verse 18 says, he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Do not get on the wrong side of God. Hebrews 10:31 says that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. His wrath will be brought down on sin and on sinners. Which side of the wrath of God are you on? Which side of the wrath of God are you on? Verse 9. Now Harbona, one of my favorite characters in the story. He doesn't get much run, but I think he's a great guy. He's one of the same ones, if you look back to Esther 1, he's one of the 7 eunuchs that had to go and get Queen Vashti. And here he shows up again. He's in the room. They've got a bag over Haman's head. The king's a little upset. Queen Esther is probably still kind of wondering how this is all going to play out. And Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, has an idea. And he has the freedom to speak his idea. Apparently, the operational staff at the palace wasn't too thrilled about Haman, because the first opportunity they had, they said, let's get rid of this guy. And Harbona, maybe the spokesman for the rest of them, was all too eager to jump at the opportunity to get rid of Haman. Verse 9, he says, look, the gallows. I imagine him in my mind's eye, there being a big window there in the palace. And he says, King, if I may, look out this window. See those gallows? Those are gallows that Haman made to hang Mordecai. Somehow he knew that. Word had gotten out. Those are gallows that Haman made to hang Mordecai on. And as Ahasuerus usually does, as we've seen? He says, good idea. Let's do it. Hang him like a dog, right? And it says, verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. What a change of events. In mere hours, God has flipped this whole script on its head. Never underestimate God's power to turn things around. Only a short time after, not sure exactly how long after, the decree was written by Haman and delivered, the author of the decree is dead on the gallows he made. How quickly God can turn things around. Haman is defeated. His evil reign has come to an inglorious end. He thought he was too powerful to be stopped. He thought he was the one that the king wanted to honor. He thought his power could not be checked, and yet he was always on a leash. Now, it seems as we read through the story, it was a long leash at times, and it was, but it was a leash nonetheless. Did Haman ever really have a chance of winning? Could Haman actually overthrow the promises of God? Or was he a deluded villain who thought himself much greater than he actually was? You know who I think Haman is a picture of? Satan. He's a picture of Satan for us, the ultimate villain who thinks he can win, but was never going to win. He was always going to be defeated. And I think Haman pictures that for us. Now, at the end of chapter 7, the Jews in Persia are living between two realities. I want you to see this because this will set us up for next week. They're living between two realities. The biggest enemy to the Jews in Persia, Haman, has been eliminated, but the threat was not over. Haman is gone, but what is still in place is the unchangeable decree. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the Persians could still kill, annihilate, and destroy the Jews. They weren't saved yet. The story is not over. Something had to be done to stop that decree. And I think there's a lesson there for us. Here's the Persian Jews living between two realities. Their foe has been defeated, but the threat is not over. You know, we live between in those two realities as well. Through the death and resurrection of Christ, Satan has been defeated. His powerful rule is limited. His doom is sure. And yet the threat is not over, because we still live in a world that is marred and controlled by sin. We still live with a sin nature. See, the enemy is defeated, but the threat still exists. The war is won, but the battle is not over. We live as Christians between victory and final victory. What has happened and is what is still yet to come. So in the meantime, between victory and final victory, who is on the Lord's side? Whose side will you be fighting on? Moses asked the people right after the golden calf incident. He basically drew a line in the sand, and he said, who is on the Lord's side? Come stand over here. Joshua did the same thing to the people towards the end of his life. He said, choose you this day whom you will serve. See, Moses and Joshua both knew that victory was on the Lord's side. Mordecai also had that faith, I believe. Though at times throughout the ups and downs of the story of Esther, it didn't necessarily look like victory was on the Lord's side. But know this about God. Though God may be invisible, his victory is inevitable. Though God may be invisible, his victory is inevitable. It will happen. And you can work with God in that victory, or you can work against him and bear the wrath of God. Choose wisely. Choose wisely. Let's pray.